Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 72. I am your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we are excited to have with us the highly talented and internationally revered comic artist and graphic designer, Seth Martel. Seth, thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thanks for having me tonight.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's Stephanie just saying she just had a woot, so we know she's watching.
Hey, Stephanie.
So this is great, and I know with Stephanie watching, when I interviewed her a few months ago, I said, it was a great interview, and I said, and she recommended, she said, reach out to Seth. Seth has a lot of good things to talk about. So, and thank you for answering your email too. But I appreciate that, Seth. So that was good. Who is this guy? Yeah, no. So I appreciate that you answered it and didn't.
I watched the whole interview. I've watched a bunch of your interviews now, but I was there for Stephanie's live too. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was good. So before we jump in, because I got a nice list of questions for you, and I know we have a lot of things to talk about. So for the folks that haven't seen your work through Graphics Mundi or Unlikely Hero Studios, that are familiar with some of your work and some of your other work, do you want to kind of give people a quick background on how you got into comic book art and also graphic design?
Sure. Like so many artists, I was a comic book fan growing up, and I really did enjoy just reading comics and making as many stories as I could, drawing at every ounce of free time that I had. My head was down, with pencils and paper. But then, as I got a little bit older, I started trying to think of how I would make a practical career out of it. Because like I said to you earlier, I was just born an old man, and I was worried that how would I ever pay bills? So, I went to school for graphic design, and I really enjoy graphic design too. So it was never an issue. I always really, really liked it. But, graphic design is structured, and you have so much more freedom with actually drawing with, pen and paper, or, really with using your hands in a different way than the structure of design itself. And, I started looking for creative outlets, and actually before going back to comics, I first started working for probably about 7 years. I was working at a haunted house, and I was doing set painting and makeup every night and helping plan out the attractions. And that was actually, in a really weird way, kind of like tangentially related to comics, because you were planning characters, putting kids in rooms, actually assigning roles and building environments. And that's a lot like the storytelling related to comics. So the one thing about it, though, that got frustrating is it's like the haunted house it's just so ephemeral. Like it lasts for that season, and then it's gone, and you start from scratch. And that's really cool in a way, but also, you really only just have like memories and a few pictures from it. And I really started missing having like something tangible in my hand that like I actually did work on and got to finish and create. So I started drawing again, and I wasn't really drawing with the idea of comics at first, but I just was really drawing to have something real and something I could hold on to. And then I started trying to remember really why I started picking up graphic novels again. And I just started picking some up, and then just decided it was time that I started drawing and putting it to like a real memorable, holdable thing again that I actually had created.
And so as you brought up, do you consider as also that when you put together that comic book, when you mentioned it, when you started talking about that, how important did your graphic design background affect the style of your comic book art?
I think basic fundamental principle, all the principles of design that you learn, a lot of them are just intrinsic. You kind of know them when you just understand composition on a page. And it's just trying to teach someone's eyes how to follow the story. But it's also the same thing when you're trying to get them to follow the story down a postcard, or trying to teach them how to follow the story down a flyer or a brochure you're creating. It's getting someone to start in one place and finish where you want them to finish. Right. And, besides just the actual composition, the practical things about design of like understanding the software it takes and understanding size specs and how things will reproduce, understanding color reproduction, those types of things that you learn without even really meaning to in graphic design. Like it slowly just becomes like part and parcel of creating all of your products. It helps you so much when you're actually working in comics to know how things will, like how the end product will make its way onto paper.
So would you say like a good recommendation, and we're looking at, these are the storyboards for, and this is for Andromeda, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And do you say, so for instance, would you recommend anybody that's going into comic book art to that's doing comics and designing comics, that there has to be a graphic design component in that education?
The thing about comics is nothing has to be any certain way, which is like the greatest part about it is you could make anything you want, and as long as you're telling the story you want to tell, it's a comic for you. You're telling a story, and that's really awesome. But if you're really trying to, I think, probably take more traditional routes and have more traditional products, it really helps. It does help a lot. A lot of questions are answered that you would just know with the experience of being a graphic designer.
And how much, because I love how even one of the aspects that I love about your design on that is you seem to take the entire page and look at it as almost as like one piece of art, one piece of design, where you actually kind of have the frames work to help tell the story. How often do you see, would that be a recommendation when you're talking to other up and coming artists, is like, do you recommend like looking at frame per frame, for instance, like in our Instagram world, everything say, hey, for reproduction values, if you want to tell a sequential story, keep it in a square, that way people can flip through. What would be your recommendation on, if you're looking at some of the long form stuff, what's the give and take on that, on looking at like full page designs?
If you zoom out on your page that you've just drawn, and if you can draw if you can draw a line that follows where you want the viewer's eye to go, then it's a successful page. If you're just drawing a line straight down the page, that's not exciting. It's not taking up the space that you really want to take. If someone's going to buy your book, you don't want them to flip through it in 2 seconds because all they did was read straight down the middle.
Right.
You really want to take up, you're given this real estate. You really want to make the best use of it.
And how much, because you also do lettering as well, and how important is to make sure the frame, the word bubbles, the lettering itself, how much of that where you want to, like, you take that step back and make sure everything seems to be connected, and what kind of advice would you give to other artists about that?
I'm an accidental letterer, or maybe just like a letterer out of necessity. I'm doing essentially lettering every day in my graphic design job. So it's just like, well, I can do this. And for me, with the creation process, somebody like Stephanie, she's pre-writing scripts, which is great. But then it's really nice to have the ability to just one-on-one say, hey, this takes up an awful lot of space here. Can we split it up? I'll show you how it looks. And you have that back and forth, conversation then, where you can instantly try to fit it in the way that you're not disrupting the flow, but still getting the story across. And secondly, for myself, when I'm working on my own comics, if I'm lettering it myself, I can just revise on the fly, but I'm also writing. I'm writing script that way, because I don't write script in a traditional way where it's all pre-written. I'm actually doing plot beats and notes and then doing the script on the page.
Right. So let me ask you this. So how important is it to have that relationship with the writer on that? How, when you sit down, and as we mentioned, for instance, Andromeda, which was written by Stephanie, and we'll talk about that. So that was written by Stephanie. How much of that back and forth is there when you get the script to say, this is what and you kind of give when you kind of give the storyboards, do you give the storyboards out to her first, and then there's a back and forth on that? Or how much direction do you expect from a writer, and how much do you say, thank you, but this is kind of my side of things?
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is Stephanie is just such a really great and flexible writer and collaborator. So that second panel right there, I had shown her thumbnails that I didn't fit into there because they're just beyond really unintelligible thumbnails. And the second one that I showed her there, she did a draw over for me, and it was so helpful because when you have somebody who's really willing to take the time to do that, you're both going to get the product you want. Like you want to tell the right story, you want to tell the story with the best impact you can, and you want to help the writer get on the page exactly what's in their head, um, especially if they really have a clear idea in their mind's eye of what it should be.
And,
so
okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, so that's like a slightly refined but still really rough version, and that's the type of one where I can actually start laying in letters and show people how much real estate that letter box or the word bubble will take up.
Mm. And have you ever, working with maybe other writers who might not understand how page layout happens, and they're like, "Hey, can you make this bigger, make this smaller? Can you do this?" And then, how often do you have to say, "Well, we have to put in enough space for the words as well"? How much of a conversation do you have to have with writers like that?
It can be rough, and like those, those comics aren't successful, and that's why you don't always, that's why you're not seeing them right now, because sometimes they're not good. They don't really go anywhere. They're just, if a writer is too held up on only one way to tell the story and can't see around it,
Right.
it doesn't mean that no one can tell their story. It just means that they're losing out on a really interesting part of the collaboration.
Right. And do you see like differences as well when it comes to, comic writers? Do you ever have to kind of help sit down with them and to say, "Hey, this is a little more descriptive than you need to. I can draw this. You don't need to have this written out." How often does that happen?
The hardest part is teaching people that are writers who don't have a lot of experience that you're not writing something in motion. You're not writing a movie script. Someone in one panel can't turn around but then open the door in front of them while tying their shoe. You can't have multiple direction, angles happening. And even though that could be something that could happen live, you
Right.
have to have a very stopped feeling that moves little by little. It doesn't mean that it can't happen off panel and you can't figure out ways around it, or you can't try to make it work, but sometimes you read a script and you're like, oh no, there's too many things happening here.
So do you see that kind of like as that's a growing process of it? And once you kind of create a good rhythm with a writer, do you try to kind of stay connected with them to say, "Hey, let me know when your next one's coming out," or "Let me know if there's something else I can do," or how does that relationship kind of bud, and how do you and what do you do when you work with some writers who really like your work, but you're like, "Thanks, but how does that work?" I guess.
It's you always weigh your options. Every job is like, well, what's it going to pay? How long is it going to take? Like, what type of time investment is like, what's the return on investment versus like the pain points that you're really going to encounter?
Right.
It's just like any freelance job you're going to take. And some people you really like, but they're not necessarily people that you want to work with. And then the people that you find that are just really great collaborators, that's why you see me working with Stephanie all the time. We had finished the COVID Chronicles entry, and we both have bigger projects that we're trying to work on. And then she saw this story call for entries for Andromeda in Mermaids Monthly. And she's like, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And I said, "Sure." Not just because I know that it's going to be such a fun experience. If you have somebody that you can really enjoy, that back and forth, it makes it fun, and pausing other projects for a great experience, those are the things that are worth it. And you don't even know sometimes if it's going to get picked up, but if you're making something you enjoy, I think that that's far more important in the end, because your end product shows the fun that you had.
And so Yeah. So you mentioned that is like, so what do you do in those situations where, what would be your advice for the artists that say, a couple of years on that they have a good setup with, with a writer. At what point do you always try to keep making sure that there's still, because this is a job that pays, that you have to make sure there's contracts involved, or when you're working with somebody, you say, all right, we've established a good working relationship. Do you ever get laxed on any of that stuff, or how does that work?
Yeah, contracts are really important. It depends, of course, the relationship, but most of the time it's really just safest because it keeps friendships healthy and it keeps friendships, cut and dry.
Hmm.
Um, but in the past, yeah, I've definitely been screwed over by not having contracts in place, by promises that really actually were developing, even with editors that had been hired that were exciting to work with, and
Hmm.
creative teams that were getting put together. So you can't always you can't let that kind of like that glitter and excitement totally confuse. It can distract you because
Right.
you're so excited and you're so hungry to work with on a project that you're stoked to be part of, but that doesn't mean that it's ever going to come to fruition. It doesn't mean that someone or like whoever is financially backing it won't just decide to stop in the middle of it.
Right.
So you need to have something in place that says what will happen in each stage of that if something changes.
Right. And have you been, and with that said, what would be a timeline for you to say, all right, uh, like what would be the amount of like pages per, for how long it would take? Like, hey, if this is a 6 pager, then I need this much in advance. If this is going to be a whole 32 pager, I'll need this much time in advance. How would you gauge that? What would be your advice for artists who are working on those contracts?
It's interesting. I listened to some of your other podcasts, and you had someone on before named Anusha, and she was very cut and dry with how she did things. So it was very smart. But it's a little bit different for everybody, and she talked about how the flexibility is like how you're gauging your own time and what you want to work on and what will this afford you to do something else. And it really is a balancing act. You really have to find what will keep you happy, what will keep you paid, and what's paying for the things that like the tools that you use aren't always cheap. Like what's paying for your iPad upgrade to make sure that you're providing the best art, or um what's paying for. Some people are just relying on freelance art to pay the bills, and that's really tough too. I have a 9 to 5 job, so I only have a certain amount of time. So I know for me, I'm only taking on jobs that I enjoy and I can afford that, but I also only have a certain amount of time. So I can't take on every fun job too. I have to be really careful with how I use my time.
So yeah, you brought up. So I'm curious to talk about your style and how you actually create your work. Are you all digital, or you do a lot of pen and ink, or how do you come up with your work?
I'm almost entirely digital, but I can show you like this is where I start. So I
Okay,
start thumbnails on I'm starting thumbnails on a pretty simple page, and
right.
that helps me kind of figure out the amount of space I'm taking up, and still gives you like the old fashioned, pencil on paper feeling that I think I need for the composition, like for true composition. After that, then I can move to digital, and I have an iPad Pro, and what I like about it is the texture that the depth you can give in with like the different washes that afford you that feeling of like there's depth and there's lighting, and you can kind of think about how you're going to use lighting to your benefit,
Hmm.
but you don't have to pull out a brush and water. Like it's really helpful in that way where you can get effects and you can get the looks that you're trying to go for without actually having to do it in the middle phases.
Do you use is that you use Procreate for this, or?
I did use Procreate for it. I've used Clip Studio as well and Photoshop, but Procreate was the one for this one.
Okay. And so, and through there, do you export it to another thing to put in the words, or is it all you do that through Procreate?
No, I airdrop all my files into InDesign and
Okay.
build a document depending on whatever the call for submissions actually gives you for specs. And then I create those specs up in InDesign. Then I can letter and I can know exactly how big the letters will be on the page because that's really important. And you can't take it for granted. It's just your letters have to be legible. They can't be huge and they can't be too small. Like the amount of times that you see, new letterers or really the people who really don't know about lettering making things far too tiny that
Yeah.
it's such a shame because you're losing so much of the story. And no one wants to put on glasses to read your story. They don't want to sit there with their nose in a book trying to read it. It's going to give them a headache and they're going to give up. And it doesn't matter how good the art is. They're just going to flip through it and call it a day.
Yeah. Wait, so you do the lettering in InDesign?
I do. A lot of people use Illustrator, but I found that
Oh,
InDesign has enough Pathfinder options that I can actually float them over like a new layer. And um, I think just because I spend so much of my time in InDesign, I've really become fast at it, as opposed to, and I really like seeing the page layout where it's actually like, bookended and,
right.
having the facing pages where you can see how it will look as you kind of flip through. I find that really important to make sure that um, that your flips are correct. Your story beats are on the right pages that you want them to be. So, in a short story, it's not as big of a deal, but you still want to make sure that all of your panels, you don't want to have the same panel across the entire book. You want to make sure that there's a lot of variation.
Hmm.
You just
And
don't want people to get bored.
right. So talk to us a bit about, so we mentioned before we got on the air that you've been great at connecting to different aspects of the comic book world. You're with, Graphics Mundi, Unlikely Hero Studios, which just successfully had their Kickstarter, um,
Yep,
and
fully funded, which is awesome. Those
fully
those guys
funded.
are hustlers. Yeah, that's a great team to work with. They know what they're doing, and they're really good at putting it together and drumming up the right amount of attention and talking about strategy to make sure they're great at communicating too. So highly recommend that. Highly recommend working with them.
So how is it different between that you see working on, say, like an anthology series, like, COVID Chronicles or Elsewhere Volume 2, compared to some of your other work where it was just a kind of a singular story that was, how would you compare, drawbacks, benefits of doing anthologies versus single stories?
Sure. So the three stories that you're just mentioning, they were all part of anthologies, or mixed with speculative fiction, or different. One was in a magazine, so they're all a little bit shorter, and
Right.
I really I enjoyed them because I like them because they're a break from your everyday larger works that you're working on. And I don't know if it's for everybody because I think for some people it can be a distraction, but I think if I'm working on two projects at once, I like each of them so much because I can get tired of one and then jump to the other because it's a nice distraction.
Hmm.
And it keeps my interest, and it keeps my momentum going.
Yeah.
So each of these companies though were interesting because one was a Kickstarter, one was a call for submissions that was just paying you for use of the book, paying you for use of your story once you uh, just get approved or not approved. And then the other one was a fundraiser. The COVID Chronicles was actually a fundraiser, which was going towards bookstores that were suffering during the last year for COVID. But it was through a university press, and that was also a really cool and interesting group to work with because you know they're working on a different style of book. It's a little bit quieter. It's a little bit more academic, but
Hmm.
um, no less fun to work for. They're really interesting products that they make. They're just it's just each one is still telling a story. So I really enjoy all of them.
So which one do you have a specific type of genre comic that you prefer, whether it be the slice of life stuff or the sci-fi, or which would do you kind of, is there anything that you when you talk about projects that are fun to work on, is there anyone that, like, if you have like three, like a fantasy, superhero, slice of life stuff that kind of like put on your plate, all have the same thing? Is there one genre that you will kind of always type to lean towards?
Yeah, I definitely think that if there's a supernatural horror element, I take to it if
Oh,
somebody
really?
pitches it to me. Yeah, I think it's just so long working in the haunted house industry. I can't quite help it. And there's really not like, the two out of those three that you had there were definitely a little bit more on that side. I haven't done any like full on horror, but the book that I'm working on, like the larger scale graphic novel, has some kind of like supernatural suspense elements to it, and it's not like the heart of the book. The heart of the book really is kind of like a coming of age story, but I just kind of feel like for me that's like what keeps my interest as a reader. So it's got to keep my interest as an illustrator too.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, so the mayor, is that the one that you were talking about?
Yeah, that's the graphic novel I'm working on right now. It's about, looks like it's going to be about 4 chapters worth, somewhere around like the high 80s pages or so. I've thumbnailed all the pages. I've got it working its way through right now, and part of that came about just because while I was doing these smaller stories, I needed something consistent to work on. We've all been stuck home during this last year, and I needed a project that kind of like had some sort of like almost like comfort food drawing, something that felt like connected to. And I'm a child of the 90s, so like I really wanted to kind of take it back to something that felt like it felt familiar, and like I could listen to music I really was nostalgic for. It wasn't something I listened to every day, but like picking up some back old ideas, and just reminded me of like what really inspired me when I first started picking up graphic novels after I kind of got not over superheroes, but just like my natural next step. So it kind of made me think of like Neil Gaiman's Sandman and like Death: The High
Okay.
Cost of Living,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
I just loved his books. How they were just, there was a whole world of you know slightly bizarre and off things happening around very normal people, and I think that's where I always like to find it, because the world is pretty weird. So when you're taking a look around you and you see all this, you see what just doesn't quite make sense, and you try to kind of put a little spin on it to make it fun, or you make it kind of fantastic or strange, and it it makes you want to know a little bit more. So I kind of took the main character back to a time of like, that like teen angst, like feeling of like you're lost after high school, and so many people around you feel like they know exactly what they're going to do, and it makes you feel a little left behind. And also, I think the biggest thing for me was, I'm not, I get to work with really amazing writers who have these brilliant, complex worlds that I don't think my mind works in that way. So like I get excited when I get to work with other writers like Stephanie, and because that it opens doors to things that I wouldn't normally do. So then when I come back to my own, I try to remind myself, like, don't make things too complicated. Keep it simple. Like, do something you enjoy, so it always feels like something you're going to like when you're picking up your pen.
Mm. Have you been able to reach out? Because as you're talking about this, the mayor is a book that you're writing, and you're illustrating as well. And have you had have you learned something from have you learned something that from other writers on how to script it out, since we're working with others?
For sure. And I think more than that, I think peer review is so important.
Mm.
Finding people you trust, that you respect their opinion, that understand it, how to critique you, because everybody takes critiques in different ways.
Mm.
I don't, I think after, going to art school where you're pretty picked apart, you're like, I have a pretty thick skin, but that doesn't work for everybody. And so you really need to find the right circle around you that can tell you the things you need to hear, but tell it to you in the way that you need to hear it.
uh, Stephanie just said the mayor is very layered and complex and splendid. Can't wait. So
Ah, Thanks, Stephanie. I can't wait to finish it.
So with your planning, you mentioned it's going to be like, are you planning on splitting it out into separate issues and maybe like in 3 volumes and then trying to do a Kickstarter for each one, or what's your plan on that?
It could be 4 issues. I wrote it in 4 chapters. It could be issues because they're in like the 20 count each in the chapters. And I think, as much as I'm trying to write a straight up graphic novel, I think there's just something that hits me in so many years of being trained by trades that just kind of give you that idea of how to pace things.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't read well all the way from start to finish. And if that was the end place it went, I would be totally okay with it too.
Yeah.
I think there's something really nice about having just that chunk in your hand. And I know as an adult, like sometimes I'm just not really patient or don't have the time to read a little, an issue at a time. And I'm appreciating the awesome, afternoon of just, indulging in a graphic novel. It's really nice.
Yeah. And so talk to us a bit about, because using Procreate on the, and did you use Procreate on the Mare as well? That's what
it did. Yep.
Okay. Now, how important is it from the graphic design perspective to make sure that there's the same, that like the color palette? How important would you recommend to artists is like, making sure that colors match, making sure that that's actually part of the design too?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm realizing, I shouldn't say realizing, I definitely have always known, I'm not bad at color and I can pick out colors, but a colorist is a completely different thing. So I can understand thematic colors. I think I'm good at, but being a true colorist, there are people who really study and deserve all of the credit for setting a different tone for the story that you may not think of yourself. And right now I have it in black and white and it might stay in black and white, but hiring a colorist is one of my options too, that I think could be a really great option. For me, one of the things is, as you saw, like on the earlier page, how things were blue and on the cover things are blue.
Right.
The whole thing is the mare, is short for nightmare. And part of it is like related to just like old folklore. It's about, the mare is a restless spirit that harasses you in the night and you don't know what is really causing it. It's always kind of related to, like in modern times, it's related to sleep paralysis. And that's what people kind of attribute the modern version of, like, where the folklore came from. And I wanted to signify in a way, even if it wasn't necessarily such a dramatic thing happening around the character as they fell asleep, the blue creeping into their life, either it makes them sleepy or they're really suffering from kind of like this point in time of feeling trapped, like sleep paralysis makes you feel trapped. And so I'm using it kind of as a color signifier through the book.
And then like some of your other work that you've done with your other projects through, Elsewhere Volume 2 and COVID Chronicles and things like that. How deliberate are you also with that, with those color palettes?
Yeah, in Small Acts in COVID Chronicles, that was actually Stephanie's idea for the cue of how to handle it, because in her story, especially in the beginning of when COVID was affecting everyone, the world was feeling very bleak and the world was pretty gray. And she was trying to remind everyone in the story how all these little things in your life are still there to appreciate. And all the little things you do, other people are also appreciating. And those are the small bits of color that are showing in the story around a very bleak world. So, it was dedicated to her husband, who's a physician who works with COVID patients, and also just how the little things he was doing and the little things he was appreciating around him in his life were bringing color to his world, even though it was still such a tough time.
And I gotta say, it seems as though it's like one of your trademarks is having always that horizontal frame. Is that something that you've always either just by happenstance put in, or are you deliberate to making sure you always have like a horizontal frame? It seems like.
I don't know.
Is it the graphic designer in you that wants to make sure there's, there seems to be some flow like that?
Maybe. I think I don't necessarily think I know what I'm doing all the time. I I just think about how I'm, going to try to cover what I want to cover within the story and get these, get the eye to move across the page. And so, it's always interesting when somebody else looks at what you've done because, you know, you, when you're actually the illustrator, you have an idea of how you're trying to get your point across, but maybe you can't see the forest for the trees because you spent so much time with it, which is a
Right.
really awesome and important reason you need really great editors and really great collaborators to say, hey, did you see what you've done here?
So talk to us a bit about the those connections you make. As you said, you work with Graphics Mundi, Unlikely Hero Studios. What would be your advice for artists who are wanting to get in the field and saying, how did you, especially, the 2020, there wasn't a lot of conventions, there wasn't the ways that people would normally connect and network, just frankly didn't exist. So what would
Sure.
be some of the advice that you would give to artists that are coming out of art school, or people that are wanting to get back into it? What would be some of your advice for them?
I mean, so much of it, you have to take a step back and think of how you thrive. Like, where do you do best? In
Mm.
person is clearly not an option right now, but there are so many resources online. We're very lucky now. Back when we were younger, these options really weren't out there in the type of tangible way that they are now. There's amazing artist resources like Create. The Comics Experience is it's an online school, but also offers creators workshops where you can go and you can post your work online and co-critique, which is really helpful
Mm.
for people. I was a member there for a very long time. And that's actually where I met Stephanie. And
Oh,
part of
cool.
it is you can see what other people are posting and learn about their style, learn about their critique style. And I thought, for me personally, like, as I was meeting her, I saw how she was thoughtfully critiquing. Not only was she talented, but she was taking time to think about how she was delivering information to somebody else, and that's somebody you want to work with.
Right.
Um, there's also really great Discord channels out there that you can find, through Twitter groups, or I don't really know any through Facebook, but I've heard that there's some really decent Facebook groups out there as well. I just
Yeah.
haven't been on there as much.
Yeah. And yet you mentioned Twitter. That seems to be like your main social network. So would you recommend Twitter over, say, like Instagram or Facebook, or for instance, for connecting with other artists?
It's all an experiment that you have to see where you kind of make your best inroads. And in my day job, besides being a graphic designer, I also manage our social media account, and it is interesting to see how different my day job social media account does in different platforms. It doesn't really do as well in Twitter, but it does amazing in Instagram,
Mm.
and our following has just increased exponentially over the last year. And a big part of it is, how are you going to post and how are you going to interact? Instagram really rewards consistency and interactivity, and Twitter, you really want people to, are you ready to be in every conversation there? Are you ready to actively talk to your audience when they are ready to, trying to interact with you as well?
Mm.
um, and Facebook, I think a lot of people do find luck in Facebook. I found, just since it was such a political year last year, I just kind of avoided it.
I know you do it. This you create the community you deserve. Basically, like, if you interact with them, and as you say, you work, as you mentioned before, is like, responding and all that kind of stuff, and that you kind of do, you're able to, foster those networks, which I think is a good point. But as you say, it depends on, each one kind of does its own thing in a way too. So yeah.
It does, and a lot of people find success with Instagram. For me, I found a little bit of the square. Well, I mean, it doesn't really even have to be totally square anymore. Like, you can crop a little bit more vertical now, but it is. I find it a little bit more restrictive, and I can't
Mm.
quite tag and sharing is a little bit more restrictive there, which is part of what is also nice and safer there too. You're not opening yourself up to like as possibly like frustrating of a discourse there. So it could be a very nice and safe way to start out.
Right.
Yeah, social media is a crazy beast, though. It really is.
I know. I know yeah, and it's important to make sure that you're using it and it's not using you. So it's keep yourself sane like that.
Yeah, it can be really rough on your confidence too. I think a lot of people go into it hoping that they're just gonna, instantly be praised for everything they put up there, but everything you're putting up can just as easily be torn down. You don't know who these people are because it's just faceless people behind, sitting at home who aren't necessarily going to take the time to treat you like a human, and you have to be, you have to be ready for that.
Right.
So it's not always the best place.
Yeah. So would that be like a recommendation? Is like kind of pick maybe one of them and just kind of foster a community through one avenue that you feel most comfortable with?
Yeah, and think about who you are. If you're a sensitive person, maybe work within private groups to make sure that you're shielding yourself from. If you don't feel like you're ready for it, then don't put yourself out there quite yet, because there's nothing more discouraging. Even if it's not, even if it really is the best thing you've ever made, all it really takes is a little bit of someone trying to tear you down because they're having a bad day, and you really have to have built your own confidence to know that you're okay with that, and to be able to shut that information off and just take the important good criticism that you can actually learn from.
And so how did you connect with Unlikely Hero Studios? Was that through the same group, or how did that work?
No, I was really searching for calls for submissions, and I think I found them on Twitter again, through different advertising routes. So they were looking for submissions for their anthology, and
Okay.
and they just kind of hit right at the right time when we had the time to work on a project and submit it. A big part of it is just the right place at the right time with comics. You can't. I think that's with every industry. I guess I shouldn't just say it's comics. You never know what's going to work when it's going to work. You just can't be discouraged when it doesn't work, because it doesn't work all the time.
Right. So I've seen a lot of these though. That these anthology things you've worked with Stephanie on this one.
Yeah.
And then I think all three that we did, the COVID Chronicles one, and then the Mermaids, Andromeda. Okay, so let me ask you, who's driving the bus here? Does Stephanie come to you and say, "Hey, can we do this?" Or have you been able to go to Stephanie and say, "Hey, I got a great story, I got an idea. Can you write it for me, and then I'll draw it"? Does that happen too?
For the first one, it started with small acts in COVID Chronicles, and I told her about it. And actually, before it was in COVID Chronicles, it was in a different fundraiser that I had heard about.
Okay.
It was fundraising for the Get Us PPE project, and it was very, very early. And I just said to her that it was something that I believed in, and I really wanted to find a way to contribute in a way that I could contribute, but I didn't have anything to write. And I just thought that, I said, "Do you think you could write something?" And she said, "Sure." She's really great at always being up for a challenge, and came up with something like that. I think she's just got a million ideas floating around in her head, and she's just waiting for something, just waiting for whatever door and opportunities is going to take that next one. And it was it just worked well, and it sparked a really great creative friendship, and that was really amazing, because I've worked with so many collaborators in the past where I think the hardest thing is you invest so much time. I mean, there was other writers in the past that I've worked with where I've done so many pages that never saw the light of day, and even if you're getting paid for it, that's really disheartening. And you don't. What do you do with it?
Right.
I'm not in it for. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, like the money is nice if you really need to pay bills, but it's not really the end goal.
Would that be something though? Like, would that be a recommendation? Maybe it's like, when you're negotiating a contract, to say, "Hey, I want to make sure that after a certain amount of time, I can utilize these images for something else." Or
yeah, I do think that's really important, and even for some of the digital releases, you can actually have a clause where after a digital release has existed for so long, you can reuse it elsewhere,
Okay.
which is what we did with the Get Us PPE project. From there to COVID Chronicles, the first story, Small Acts, a big part of it was that we invested time in it, but also it was, a story that was really dear to Stephanie's heart, especially during the last pandemic. And so being able to put it into print where it could last much longer and help other people, that was really nice.
Yep.
So that was all part of just making sure that the contract was well written and you weren't locked into anything.
Right. Stephanie just said that I'm sending him 10 more stories after this. So
Okay. She's got a graphic novel to write. She can't.
All right. And that was and then Greg Giordano says, great work, Seth Martel. So there's you got one of your Twitter followers there. So
thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
So what would be some good places for artists to reach out to try to find samples of contracts? How did you find out what contract would be the best way to write? Is there certain online resources that you would recommend?
There are great lawyers out there that you can hire, but for the ones that I honestly knew it was just such low stakes for them. It just was really, we just carefully read them, and having help in your life, so you're not just reading it by yourself, is really important. It really depends on how serious of a contract you're trying to get into, But by all means, I think a lawyer is incredibly helpful when it gets to that next step. Like, what's your end goal with this comic, and how important to you is it?
Right.
What do you think what's the legs on it? Do you think that you can use it again? Do you think that do you think you're getting your money's worth for it? Do you think that you're getting, like, and I don't mean like cash money. I really mean, like, do you think that the time that you spent on it and how much you care about your story?
Yeah. Good. So, talk to us about, so was Elsewhere the first Kickstarter that you were a part of?
It was, yeah, it was. And I'd always been kind of hesitant about a Kickstarter because I didn't really know enough about how they work to really start it, to get into it myself. And I think a big part of what these guys did as a group, they are really amazing at having, fun, thoughtful stretch goals that their audience are really looking for, keeping momentum going, having really diverse comics within the anthology that I think there's something for everybody.
Right.
And, and also just making sure that they check in a lot along the way. And I have a huge amount of respect for people that are diligent and thoughtfully running something, because there are so many people in comics that are unintentionally flaky. I don't think anyone means to be, but everybody gets caught up in their life, and everybody gets caught up in so many things around them. But when you're running a campaign with so many people who invested time,
right,
having people who care and see things through, you gain a lot of respect for them, and you really want them to succeed as much as seeing yourself succeed, because that there's a reciprocal investment happening.
And you say also too, like, that one of the benefits of doing an anthology through Kickstarter as well, does it help also expanding your readership and maybe your audience as well?
Oh, heck yeah. I mean, like, you think about it, every story has how much of a creative team, and each one of them tells one person. That person possibly tells another, but if they tell two people, it's exponential, and it's a really smart way to start small, or to start, especially for new creators. I highly recommend anthologies, because I've bitten off graphic novels before that they've gone all the way through, but there's such a short-term learning experience that you get from working within anthologies, because the timelines are quick. You're learning exactly how to budget your own time. You're learning exactly how to budget your time with your co-creators too. If they have to get to a next step. In fact, Andromeda, we were going to have a colorist take care of it, but getting short windows of submission times, knowing that you have to make it, the colorist just didn't have enough time, and I had to do it myself.
Okay.
And you learn how, if that falls through, what can you fix it yourself? Can you take care of it? Should it go without? you can always go black and white, but what if the submission is for all colors? So you're juggling, but you're learning how to juggle only a few balls instead of, chainsaws. So
yeah. Wow. So this is great. So it looks like Seth, we're knocking on the top of our hour here. So as we mentioned before, the best place for people to find you, would that be you have your website, but also you have your Twitter, is you utilize that a lot too, right?
yeah, basically for Twitter, I just use it because it's such a quick way to reach me. But my website also has my email, and it has, easy contact information for me there. So it really depends on just what somebody's comfortable with. Sometimes with Twitter, you just want to just drop in and leave a quick
Right.
comment or a note, and an email might feel a little bit too intrusive or too much. But if someone just wants to leave me a quick DM or a question or graphic design questions or anything about stories or anthologies, by all means, please reach out.
Yeah. Great. So looking forward to seeing more of the mayor. So we know that's one of your projects that you're working on, but no dates yet. You don't want to shoehorn yourself into anything specific yet. So
no, I got too much work left to do. But I'm excited. It's it's in a solid enough place that I feel like, there's an end in sight, which is really exciting. Yeah. And the pitching process is happening right now, and that's also a really exciting and scary time. But yeah, who knows where it's really going to go from here? But
would there be any? Yeah, so now I'm curious. I mean, it's like, is there going to be some, now that you've kind of set up basically kind of a universe in a way where the story is there, because of you've dipped your toes a lot in some anthologies in the past? Has there been a thought about maybe doing a mayor like anthology where you would have other writers and artists tell different side stories?
That's really interesting. I didn't think about it for this one because of like the way that I framed the
right.
The structure of it itself. But you could create an anthology about anything and find just so many cool, diverse voices out there. So yeah. I would recommend it, and if somebody does start one, I'd probably jump in on it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Seth. This has been fascinating, and I'm super excited to finally sit down and talk to you.
Thanks, Marty. It was so nice to meet you.
Yeah. And I get it, and so, but so I see you always have your. I've seen this like Seth Christian Martel, Seth C Martel. What's your preferred?
There's really no preferred thing. It's just right. SethMartel.com was taken up by a tech guy in Connecticut for years. So